Hi, my name is Christian Preukert, and I represent research on European privacy law and global markets for data, which is joint work with Stefan Bechtold, Michael Batikas, and Tobias Kretschmer. So let me start by saying that rules for the digital world are increasingly not created through international coordination mechanisms like traditionally the United Nations, but by individual countries or regions. And this often has extraterritorial implications, leading to competition for becoming the leading rule maker within and across countries. And this is what has been coined the California or Brussels effect in the law literature. The recent examples can be found in privacy regulation. So the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, applies to companies offering goods or services to individuals located in the EU, regardless of whether the companies are actually located in the EU or not. And there's similar territoriality in other regulations like the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2020. The question then is, will national rules for the digital world have implications for other jurisdictions like EU versus non-EU countries or California versus other US states, and whether there are interactions with other policies like competition policy and industrial policy. And the focus of this paper will be an empirical evaluation of the GDPR on those terms. So what is the setting? We're going to have access to data on web technologies used by 110,000 websites, including advertising, analytics, content delivery, tracking, and so on. And we're going to find that after the GDPR comes into force, there's less third-party requests in the short run, but not really a change in the long-run trend. However, we find evidence for a sustained reduction in third-party cookies and also an increase in first-party cookies. There are also changes for websites and consumers worldwide who are not subject to the GDPR. In the paper, we also highlight heterogeneity across firms and consumers and show that privacy policies of technology firms actually become more informative. In terms of market structure, we show that basically all technology companies suffer losses or are unaffected. Only Google becomes more dominant and can actually increase its market share. So what are the implications? Our results show that GDPR acts as a tool of the EU to export its regulatory framework to other countries. And the results also highlight interactions between consumer protection, competition policy, and industrial policy. So first, a little bit of background on the GDPR. GDPR is basically a harmonization of national privacy rules in the European Union, which came into force in May 2018. And I'd like to highlight four aspects that are particularly interesting in our setting. First of all, GDPR came with a drastic increase of the sanctions regime. Second, GDPR introduced strong consent requirement for data processing, which basically changed from only regarding to cookies as before. Thirdly, GDPR introduced joint responsibility between data controllers and processors, meaning that websites can now also be liable for personal data being processed by third parties. And lastly, the territorial scope, meaning that GDPR applies to companies offering services or goods to individuals located in the EU, regardless of whether these companies are actually located in the EU or not. How do we relate to the literature? Well, there are lots of great papers in the theoretical and empirical literature on privacy regulation across many fields like computer science, communications, marketing, IS, econ, and of course law. We think that our contribution is in showing behavioral changes of websites and third-party vendors by highlighting the heterogeneity in terms of firms and consumers, and by also looking at the market power implications also across sub-markets. What's cool about our data is that we can control for pre-existing trends, and we can speak to this policy dimension by comparing EU audiences and non-EU audiences. And finally, in the paper, we have a broad legal analysis of implications for privacy regulation and for competition policy. So let me speak about the data a little bit. So we have access to a unique data set that tracks websites, technologies, and consumers over time. And we start by a list of 110,000 websites across many categories, for which we obtain additional data about the HTTP requests. So what are HTTP requests? You can think of this as all the additional content that is loaded after the HTML code. So this can be first-party content, basically hosted on the same website, stuff like images or videos, but it could also be third-party content that is loaded from external servers, including technology for advertising, content delivery, but also maybe more privacy-sensitive stuff like cookies for tracking and analytics. We get this data from the HTTP archive, which is kind of like a Wayback Machine for HTTP requests, and is publicly available, and we'll have bi-weekly information 6 months before and after the GDPR. We augment this on the firm side by adding information on privacy policies of some of the third-party entities, And on the consumer side, we're going to have access to clickstream data that allows us to observe the web behavior of users in the US and users in Germany, alongside with their demographics. So how are we going to define websites with non-EU audiences? Well, our preferred measure is the top level domain and whether it comes from an EU country. So .fr would be a website that targets French users. .de would be a website that targets German users, and so on. But we also have a couple of robustness checks where we define EU audiences based on EU languages or based on relative popularity across countries. So let me talk a little bit about the results. Let me talk about changes after the GDPR went into force. So the first picture I want to show you is the number of requests to third-party domains for EU audience websites and for non-EU audience websites. And so what you see is that directly after the GDPR comes into force, there's a strong decrease for both of these types of websites, 8% for websites with EU audience and 2% for websites with non-EU audience. We can also do this in a regression setting, where in the first column, we're basically focusing on the EU websites. In the second column, we focus on the non-EU websites. This specification includes website fixed effects. And this is how we come up with these estimates of 8% and 2%. In column 3, we're basically combining the two samples and performing a combined regression. While this looks like a little bit like a difference in differences, it's important to highlight that we're actually not interested in coming to a causal interpretation here, precisely because it's fairly difficult to find a control group of websites that are not affected by GDPR at all. So we augment this model by adding time and EU-specific trends to be able to investigate effectiveness in the longer run. And we do this by basically predicting into the future using these linear trends. And this is precisely what you see on this picture here. Again, we're distinguishing between non-EU audience websites and EU audience websites. And you'll see that for both of them, there's actually a decrease in the intercept, but then no change in the direction of the slope. And so after less than half a year, the non-EU websites are basically back to pre-GDPR levels, versus it takes about 2 years for EU websites to be reversed to pre-GDPR levels. Now let's look at personal data. Let's look at specific types of requests. Let's look at requests with cookies. What I have here on this picture is the number of requests that respond with third-party cookies and the number of first-party cookies that the website returns. And so we see a strong decrease of about 9% for third-party cookies, and actually an increase of first-party cookies worth about 2%. Again, looking at the sort of the long-run effectiveness, again, we're basically just extrapolating into the future using the linear trends from our model. We see that this change in intercept is also accompanied by a change in slope. And so here it looks like this reduction in third-party cookies is more sustained. Same holds true for first-party cookies. It's a change in the intercept, and maybe the increasing trend is even stronger after the GDPR. So what are the implications for market structure? So we find that the market for web technologies actually becomes more concentrated, and we show that this is solely driven by a market share gain of Google, and on average Google wins about 2% in the EU market. All other firms, including number 2 and number 3, Facebook and Twitter, lose market share or are unaffected. So a way to look at this in a picture is to look at a measure of concentration, the HHI index. So what I plot here are non-EU websites in black and EU websites in blue. And you see that concentration increases in the EU market and maybe follows an increasing trend in the non-EU market. To see that this is mostly driven or solely driven by Google, we can perform the same exercise by plotting the HHI and excluding Google. And here, what you see is that the concentration in the EU market actually decreases. And the other thing that's important to recognize are the scales of these axes. On the left-hand side, the scale runs from 900 to 1,000. On the right-hand side, from 60 to 80. So you see the dominance of Google in this market. What are the winners and losers in the long run? And by long run, I mean 6 months before and after the GDPR. So the clear winner seems to be Google, but then there's also services that are more directly related to data security and consumer consent, and therefore perhaps more directly related to GDPR that can also win in the EU market. Who are the long-run losers in the EU market? That's basically Google's competitors, Facebook, AppNexus, and so on. So looking into a little bit more detail, we show that Google's position becomes stronger in its most important markets, which is basically analytics and advertising, where they had a substantial market share even before GDPR. Google also loses in some other markets, and therefore, on average, the overall market share of Google comes to about 2% increase after GDPR. What are potential mechanisms? Some of which we can also support with some evidence in the paper. First of all, there are quite high compliance costs, which might be easier for larger firms. And also this issue of joint liability make websites choose bigger firms to some extent. And then second, there might be network effects, which might be stronger for Google, especially in the ad network and analytics markets. Third, there might be economies of scope with Google services. So Google is the firm that offers by far the most services in this market. And then regarding to why doesn't Facebook manage to increase its market share? Facebook is mostly active in the social media button market, where they already decrease their market share quite a lot due to the privacy scandals that happened before GDPR. So with this, let me conclude. We shown large-scale evidence on changes after GDPR. 110,000 websites and their interactions of third-party technologies helped us to come to the conclusions in the paper. We see changes also in websites that cater to mostly non-EU audiences. We see a sustained reduction in third-party cookies and also an increase in first-party cookies. I didn't have time to show you some details on the firm and consumer level heterogeneity results that we have in the paper. But I could talk at least a little bit about the dominant firm increasing its market share. So what are the implications that we'd like to draw from this study? So first of all, there are interactions between regulations across jurisdictions. Like maybe we can deliver some empirical evidence for the Brussels effect. So in the digital age, it has become impossible to restrict the effects of national laws to particular territories. The second kind of implication relates to interactions between regulation targets, and we show some evidence for a trade-off between consumer protection and competition policy. And we also highlight an angle of trade policy where the legal rules that are intended to protect European citizens can actually strengthen market positions of non-EU companies. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, I would love to receive them via email, and you can also find me on Twitter. Thank you.